Hello, Vanessa Otero. Thank you for agreeing to talk with me and through me to the students in this Global Online Academy Flex course.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
I want to ask you, first of all, about your journey into this process as a lawyer. I was wondering if you ever thought about being a journalist or had an interest in that before.
Actually, no, I never had an interest in being a journalist. And I've just always been interested in politics mainly, and I love reading. I love writing. I love analysis. My undergraduate degree is in English, literature, actually, from UCLA, and I went into the practice of law. I've been a patent attorney for 5 years. And a couple of years ago, I've kind of gotten into this field by accident. I was surprised by the kind of news sources that I'd seen people post on Facebook and Twitter, mostly to support their side of a political argument in the run-up to the 2016 election. And it really just the quality and the extreme bias in the sources really surprised me. And I just thought that there should be a way to visualize this on a vertical and horizontal axis. So I kind of cobbled together just on one of the programs I used to create patent drawings this initial media bias chart. And I had never intended for it to become, say, such a big thing, but it went viral on the internet, it got very popular, and folks from around the country and world started reaching out. So I decided to pursue it, and now I've made a company out of it.
Very good. And you acknowledge in some of your blog posts that it's hard, especially maybe the part about bias and detecting bias. And yet you persist and say we have to do it anyway. I think a lot of people kind of throw up their hands and say, we're all biased. Who knows how to figure it out? I'm not going to try.
Yeah, exactly. But if it was hard, then everyone. If it was easy, then everyone would do it. And a lot of the solutions, really big, important solutions that affect our society. Whether it be like in science or social science fields or arts, things that are hard to do are usually worth doing. And that's why I think it's so important that even though it is difficult to do what we're doing, which is content analysis, that the answers are there. We can find the answers in the text if we look closely enough and we train ourselves how to do it. And it can become easier over time. I think that we're in this temporary moment where the amount of information that's available to us has temporarily outstripped our ability to process it. Like there's so much information everywhere on the internet. How do we deal with it? We will get better. Students today are learning how to cope in this information environment and will be better than people who have only dealt with fewer sources in their lifetime. So yeah, it's not worth saying like, oh, we can't figure it all out, so let's not. If we that approach to a lot of problems, we'd still be facing some of the same ones that we faced throughout humanity.
Do you see a role for AI and algorithms in sort of streamlining the information flow or improving it in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the challenges right now is that there's almost infinite content out there. I have a media bias chart with 100 sources on there, and it's already full, right? But 100 sources is just a drop in the bucket of the number of sources that are out there. And every single day, the millions of new pieces of content are published. And the companies, the big tech companies, Facebook and Google and Twitter, they have and what definitely shouldn't be on there, and trying to balance out the editorializing. Now they have lots of resources in terms of AI and software and even human resources to get this done. But like you said, it's a really hard problem, and it's one that I think cannot quite yet be solved very accurately through artificial intelligence. The reason why is, and there are some efforts out there where people are trying to do this. They're trying to analyze, use software an AI to analyze word counts in articles, or even certain partisan terms, terminology, trying to count those and measure the sentiment or measure like the left and rightness of it. But because there's so much context and there's so much nuance, and there are things that are really hard to measure in a text, like omission bias, because you can't quite measure all of those things, then you will get some pretty wrong results. So if you try to do this process of quality analysis and bias analysis through AI, and your correctness is 70-80%, that's a really bad result. It's much better to do a smaller sample, we think, and get really highly accurate results that are measured by, they're tested still by having multiple different humans with different biases actually rate them, but a human has the ability that computers don't have to take in the context and the nuance and the omission, and that's just something that will we can do it with AI. It's just going to take a little while to get there. We plan on doing that.
Very interesting. Well, to dig into your process a little bit, I was struck when I first tried applying it at how clarifying and kind of calming it was to just do that first step of writing out the sort of basic positions that are out there on a given issue. So, the left, center, right perspective. And I just wonder, how do other people experience it that way, or how do you experience this process that you've developed?
I think that's a good way to put it. To define exactly what is left, right, and center, it does take away a lot of the uncertainty and helplessness that people feel, because if you look at the chart, it intuitively makes sense to people, but then they start looking at the categories, and then it gets really philosophical right away. Like, well, what does neutral even mean? Is there such thing as neutral? And, well, what's left today is not what's left in other countries or what was left, 50 years ago. So what do we do with all of that? And so all you have to do is anchor somewhere. And that process of defining what's left, right, and center is a process of anchoring. So the media bias chart itself, the left-right axis is anchored in a particular way. It's the United States, it is contemporary, meaning now, and it's anchored by the positions of elected officials. So why do we choose, it's kind of obvious why we choose U.S., because it's U.S. news sources, and you'd have to do different ones for France or Australia or Canada or Japan, right? So if contemporary makes sense too, because what's left and right now is not what was left and right 50 years ago, and is not what will be left in U.S. political elected officials' positions, is because that's something that's it's the most anchored of the things that we could measure. Like, we could measure, what the media says, but we're measuring the media, so that's not a very good anchor. We could also measure like what the citizens think, but that's also that's less concretely defined. You have to use polls, you have to look on social media, but what politicians do and say is part of official records. They say these things on interviews, they say these things in legislative halls, and they post them on their websites and put them on their platforms. So we can anchor using those, and that is really calming because then you can say, all right, well, this line means hyperpartisan right or skews right, and this line means hyperpartisan left skews left, and we can compare. Comparing is one of the things that also makes people a little bit calmer. You have to. That's one of the ways we analyze things as humans, just naturally.
Very cool. I'd like to take an example of a specific story in the news, and it's one that we're going to be looking at next in the second week of this course, about the Kentucky high school student who kind of got into this face-off at the Lincoln Memorial with a Native American activist. And that short video clip went viral, and it was reported pretty much everywhere.
Hmm.
And the initial reporting pretty much everywhere was wrong, I
Hmm.
think. And
Yeah.
then the subsequent reporting, came down to maybe differing interpretations. And I don't know if we really ever quite found out what happened there, or if there is one version of an authoritative version of what happened there. But I'd love to hear your
Right.
comments.
Right. I think it's a really good example of how uh, the echo chambers and the hyper partisan nature of like the of low quality news. Well, let me define that a little bit more clearly. I think fundamentally one of the problems in our contemporary media landscape is a proliferation of low quality and highly biased sources, and there's just a ton of that. It's profitable. There are many new sources that don't have long-standing reputations that make money just by getting people on their side really amped up about something. And so, we live in a kind of a tense political times right now because of lots of reasons, but one of them being the existence of these very polarizing, low-quality news sources. So, a lot has to do with how issues are framed in the title and the headline and the graphic, and the lead. Those are the first things that we measure, and and often those things are so much more inflammatory and low quality than the actual articles themselves or the actual content themselves. So how I experienced the first wave of reporting of the news story was on Twitter. People would they'd show the clip of the video, and it'd be like the one still of the young man's face with the red hat, and then the a Native American with drums, drumming in front of him. And the headline was usually something like,